Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to the leadership of the Communist Party in 1985 was the first sign of a seismic shift in the Soviet Union's ossified politics and economy. But it was Raisa Gorbachev who, both at home and abroad, soon came to embody the changes to come. She emerged as the first lady who had her own mind, her own style, and according to reports of a secret videotape that circulated after one of her foreign trips, her own American Express card. None of this endeared her to the Soviet public, who began to grumble early in her husband's tenure that she was too pushy, too flashy, and too influential. Her appearances on foreign trips and her cultural projects at home stirred debate in many Russian kitchens over whether the proper place for Kremlin wives was, as it had always been, at home or at least in the background. Raisa Gorbachev, the Czech Soviet First Lady of the Glasnost era, is dead at 67. New York Times obituary, September 21st, 1999.
In a 2016 Politico article, Kate Anderson Brower stated, "When most people think of Nancy Reagan, they picture a perfectly controlled, elegant woman with delicate features and a restrained smile, wearing one of her favorite red designer dresses. In our collective memory, she is an all-powerful First Lady, a fiercely devoted wife, and an unapologetic, reluctant mother. The news media nicknamed her Queen Nancy for her lavish spending, and some of President Reagan's West Wing advisors were so intimidated by her that they would call her Evita and the Mrs. behind her back. Nancy would further be remembered as intensely private, a fierce lover of Ronnie, and too involved, and sometimes even the spoiled girl of the White House. Nancy felt misunderstood and betrayed by the media of the White House during her time in the White House, and then she wrote My Turn so she could set the record straight." There's a tendency to see the relationship between Raisa Gorbachev and Nancy Reagan through the lens of the four meetings of the Superpower summits from 1985 to 1988, when their husbands were in office. While this is understandable, their life experiences they had long before becoming First Ladies molded their characters, which in turn would inform the dynamic between these two women when they met. Nancy Reagan and Raisa Gorbachev's lives before they were First Ladies could not have been more different.
Raisa Maximovna Gorbachev was born in 1932 in the southern Siberian town of Rubtsovsk. She was the oldest child of an itinerant railway engineer and his wife. Raisa's family was poor, but she was an eager, ambitious, and excellent student. Her academic accomplishments earned her a gold medal, which meant she was allowed entry to any institute of higher learning in the Soviet Union without having to take an entrance examination. This led her to study philosophy at Moscow State University. It was in Moscow where she met a law student by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev at a dance. The two fell in love and would soon marry. Mikhail Gorbachev began to ascend in the Communist Party ranks. He came to be known as a reformer, and there would be a steady upward movement in his career. In 1985, Gorbachev was elected as the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Raisa submerged any of her own professional aspirations to advance her own husband's career. Though in Moscow, she had taken a position as a university lecturer in Marxist-Leninist philosophy. She was known for her sharp intellect and outspoken nature.
"My life really began when I married my husband," says Nancy Reagan, who in the 1950s happily gave up an acting career for a permanent role as the wife of Ronald Reagan and mother to their children. Anne Frances Nancy Robbins was born in New York City on July 6, 1921, to actress Edith Luckett and salesman Kenneth Robbins. When her parents would separate shortly afterwards, she was sent to live with an aunt and uncle in Bethesda, Maryland. She attended a private girls' Latin school in Chicago and then Smith College in Massachusetts, earning her BA in drama in 1943. Soon after graduation, Nancy became a professional actress. She toured with the road company and then landed a show in Broadway. One performance drew an offer then for Hollywood. Billed as Nancy Davis, she performed in 11 films from 1949 to 1956. In her last movie, The Hellcats of the Navy, she played opposite of her husband. She met Ronald Reagan in 1951 when he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. The following year, they were married, and Nancy focused on being a loving wife and a good mother. While her husband was the governor of California from 1967 to 1975, she worked with a number of charitable groups. She spent many hours with visiting veterans, the elderly, and the emotional and physically handicapped. And this became very important to her as First Lady.
For all the differences in their upbringing and background, Raisa Gorbachev and Nancy Reagan were similar in one crucial aspect. They were very forceful first ladies whose opinions were held in very high esteem by their husbands. They were not averse to politics. On the contrary, both were heavily involved in exercising influence over their husbands' policies. In the case of Raisa, she was in uncharted waters. Raisa later would write, quote, "Throughout the civilized world, the position, right, and duties of the wife of the head of state are more or less clearly laid down, either in some written regulations or according to certain traditions. For example, I was told that in the American White House, to assist the president's wife to carry out her official functions at the proper level, there is the necessary staff. It turned out that I had at my disposal only one tradition, which took shape in Stalin's day, the absence of any right to a public official existence. It even strikes me occasionally that a certain section of our society regarded my public appearance with excessive partiality, as if it were the, quote, big event of perestroika." Raisa was a constant presence in the political life of her husband. She traveled both at home and abroad with him. Raisa was a force in her own right. She was fashionably dressed and showed a glamorous side unlike that of any other Soviet first lady. While in Paris, she spent time with fashion magnates Pierre Cardin and Yves Saint Laurent. The press gave her the nickname Beau Derrick of the Steppes. Many Soviet politicians, bureaucrats, and citizens were put off by Raisa's powerful persona and self-confident demeanor. Mikhail Gorbachev was open about the fact that he consulted with his wife on a variety of political issues. He was quoted as saying, "I discuss everything with my wife, including Soviet affairs at the highest level." Raisa felt the same way. She once said, quote, "We have a division of labor. He's working and I am looking around. Then I tell him everything I see." The Gorbachev's political relationship, ironically, had much in common with the Reagans.
Did I ever give Ronnie advice? You bet I did. I'm the only one who knows him best, and I was the only person in the White House who had absolutely no agenda. I make no apologies for telling him what I thought. For 8 years, I was sleeping with the president. If that doesn't give you special access, I don't know what does. I gave Ronnie my best advice whenever he asked for it, and sometimes when he didn't. But that does not mean he took it. Ronald Reagan has a mind of his own. As First Lady, Nancy did not normally meddle in policy matters, but when she thought it would serve the interests of the president best and the United States, she did in her own way. Nancy was an indispensable force in Ronald's life and political career. She served as his constant companion, inspiration, sounding board, and enforcer. She was far from infallible, though. At times, her own taste for fine clothes, her expensive redecoration hurt her husband's reputation. Her ire was infamous and not always deserved, according to the recipients. But all presidents should have their own Nancy Reagan. They need someone they know in their bones is going to look out for them, not have a separate agenda. Never let your Nancy be immobilized could be a rule of thumb for future presidents, said Richard Neustadt, who wrote in his book, Presidential Power and Modern Presidents. If he hadn't had Nancy, he never would have been president. I don't think he really would have had the drive to take the steps to run for governor, for openers, and then later run for president. She was a hugely positive force, said Nevada Senator Paul Luxo, who was also one of Ronald Reagan's good friends and political allies. In the White House, Nancy did not suffer gladly for anyone she thought was acting outside the best interests for her husband. She had little tolerance for fools, and she was not afraid to maneuver people in and out of positions. She thought Reagan's gubernatorial chief of staff, Ed Meese, was disorganized, so he did not get the job as the White House chief of staff during Reagan's first term. And Don Regan, Reagan's second-term chief of staff, incurred even higher levels of Nancy's displeasure. She felt he forgot his place and was irreverent to Ronald. When the Iran-Contra scandal threatened to blacken Ronald Reagan's second term, Nancy blamed the chief of staff. He was soon ousted.
Superpower summits between the United States and Soviet Union have been a long-standing diplomatic tradition that went all the way back to the first one held in Switzerland between Dwight Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev in 1955. Every American president from that time forward had met with their Soviet counterpart, except for Ronald Reagan. The main reason for this was that, as Reagan said, quote, "They keep dying on me." 3 Soviet leaders had died in succession between 1982 and 1985. In the meantime, relations between the two superpowers had deteriorated to new lows. The Soviets viewed Reagan as a warmonger who wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. He had referred to it as an, quote, evil empire. Reagan viewed the Soviets as the enemy of freedom and democracy. Mistrust and incendiary rhetoric by both sides heightened the chance of a full-scale nuclear conflict, which threatened to destroy civilization as we know it. Nancy Reagan also influenced the situation. She was a moderating force, encouraging her husband to tone down his rhetoric, ignore right-wing hawks in his administration, and negotiate with the Soviets.
So the rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev offered Ronald Reagan an opportunity to meet with a new, vibrant, and somewhat young Soviet leader who was eager to negotiate with the reduction in nuclear arms. Gorbachev knew the creaking Soviet economy could no longer afford the arms race, which was slowly bankrupting his country. Reagan was also eager to negotiate in order to reduce the threat of nuclear war. Reagan first invited Gorbachev to Washington, but the Soviet leader would certainly look weak if he had come straight here to the United States. So instead, it was decided they would meet in neutral Switzerland in the late autumn of 1985. Their wives would also accompany them to that summit.
Okay, we've got some dates up here on the screen. I think it's very important to explain the chronology of the meetings between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev becomes General Secretary in 1985 at the Soviet Union, whereas Ronald Reagan had been President of the United States since January of 1981. So it's 4 years into Reagan's term and about 6 months into Gorbachev's term when they decide to meet in Geneva, Switzerland. That is the first summit. They met overall 5 times. Now we have 4 of them up here listed. Geneva, the next one in Washington, D.C. a little over 2 years later, Moscow in 1988, and their final meeting in December of 1988 in New York. But Jenny, there was another time they met and one of their wives was not there.
Yes, so there was a summit in Reykjavik, Iceland, October 11th and 12th, 1986. Raisa decided to be in attendance to that while Nancy was not. We're going to go a little bit further into that here in a few moments, but there was definitely consternation on Mrs. Reagan's part about the fact that she was not there and Raisa was.
So we just want to take just a moment here and take a break from our slideshow just to have a quick discussion on, before we get into the dynamics of Raisa and Nancy meeting, on the major differences that we've delineated so far. And I think, Jenny, one of the most important is in their upbringing. Raisa grew up in the Soviet Union. She came of age that was stricken by the Second World War. They lost 50 million people. Though her family lived quite a distance from the front, they were definitely affected. Her dad was moving all over the place because railroads were very important to supplying the war machine of the Soviet Union. And even after the war, just to give you an idea of how poor the Soviet Union was during that time, and reflective of Raisa Gorbachev's upbringing, in 1946, the Soviet Union actually suffered a major famine. So she did not grow up in wealthy circumstances at all. And even after she met Mikhail Gorbachev and they got married, she had one dress. And I don't think there's ever a time Nancy Reagan did not have one dress.
Right. You know, Nancy notes at one point how challenging it is to be First Lady, and you're never prepared for it, right? But she knows that she was more prepared for this because she did have a more affluent upbringing. She went to private schools. She had a glamorous Hollywood lifestyle with, you know, access to beautiful designer clothing. She lived in a lovely home. And her and Ronald, you know, shared an amazing life together, even in their political careers as well as their acting careers, and very much in the public light, right? So that she spent a fair majority of her lifetime in front of cameras and media outlets and so forth and so on. So there was a great comfort there. Probably not the case necessarily for Raisa.
No, and I think Raisa Gorbachev, something to keep in mind that I find amazing about her is how she really took to the role. And we're going to find out she got a lot of criticism, but she was also known to be very glamorous. And she grew up in a family, pretty much the only thing they owned other than the clothes on their back and the roof over their head. Well, they didn't even own that, but was books. Right. That was pretty much it.
So this is a conversation we have here at the site. While we like to talk about the accomplishments of these women and all the wonderful things they do, you know, the public at large and the media seem to focus then really on things that seem trivial, like fashion and what their homes look like and so forth and so on. And so I think that's going to play out as we go into this discussion further. Please know that, you know, the media really starts to focus on these two women, but what they're focusing on is every little bit of how they interact and everything they wear. I mean, down to lipstick and nail color. So it's very interesting how that plays out in their relationship as well.
Absolutely. So let's move forward here. And let's talk a little bit about Raisa Gorbachev and what Nancy Reagan knew about her before they met. Raisa Gorbachev had a huge advantage over Nancy. Prior to their first meeting in 1985 at the Superpower Summit, Geneva, because there were numerous books on Nancy and her husband, thousands of news and magazine articles on her early life, her years in Hollywood, marriage to Ronald Reagan, and his political ascent. There were televised profiles and documentaries, even a Hollywood film, as Jenny alluded to earlier, starring Nancy and her beloved Ronnie together. As for what was known about Raisa, the information was sparse in the extreme. And the emphasis there should be on sparse. In today's information age, a few Google searches, as we all know, can yield a tremendous amount of resources and information. That was not the case in 1985. All Nancy Reagan had to go on were intelligence reports, which even by the standards of that time contained minimal information. There's a reason the Soviet Union was known as a secret society. On the contrary, in her memoirs, Nancy quipped, quote, as I tried to learn a little about Raisa Gorbachev, I wondered what would happen if she wanted to learn something about me. I imagined a huge truck pulling up in front of the Gorbachev's apartment in Moscow with stacks of books, articles, profiles, interviews. It would take her weeks to plow through it all. At the time of their first meeting, Raisa was 52, Nancy was 64. Nancy may have thought Raisa would take a supporting role in her presence, especially with someone who was older than her and more experienced on the world stage. Well, Raisa had other plans.
Nancy would say, I was surprised by her appearance. She was shorter than I expected, and her hair was more reddish than it appeared on television. But other than the pictures I had seen, I knew nothing about her. That in itself was unusual. Normally, when I met my counterpart from another country, I was prepared by reading about her. Raisa was a mystery. She never had given an interview. Nobody knew her age. It was thought that she had a daughter or 2 grandchildren, but nobody seemed sure about that. Practically the only thing that was known about her was that she had taught school and had lectured on Marxist philosophy at the Moscow State University. I believe to understand what could feel like hatred to another country or culture, we have to recall what was happening here in the United States at the time, and Chris has talked a little bit about that. Reagan's militant anti-communism combined with his penchant for harsh anti-Soviet rhetoric was one of the many factors that contributed to the American opinion of the Soviet Union during the Reagan administration. At his first press conference, as President Reagan questioned the legitimacy of the Soviet government 2 years later in his memorable speech in Florida, he denounced the Soviet Union as that evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world. And then in September of 1983, the Soviets shot down the Korean airliner that was en route to Alaska, from Alaska to Seoul. On that plane were 269 people who all died. 61 of them were Americans. That led to even further anti-Soviet rhetoric in the media and then in American homes.
The first meeting between Nancy Reagan and Raisa Gorbachev was held on the afternoon of November 19, 1985 at the Maison de Séjour in Geneva, Switzerland, an 18th century chateau on Lake Geneva. The following is the official declassified synopsis of the meeting prepared by Nancy's interpreter, Eugenia Ahrensberger.
Mrs. Gorbachev commented on the large number of photographers and reporters and said there were far fewer in the Soviet Union. Over tea, Mrs. Gorbachev began by describing the beauties of her country and invited Mrs. Reagan to come and visit it. Mrs. Reagan replied that she would be pleased to come, but Mrs. Gorbachev had just mentioned Siberia, and it was one place Mrs. Reagan would not like to go. It is too cold. Mrs. Reagan extended an invitation to Mrs. Gorbachev to come and visit the United States, and she said she would prefer warm time for both visits. The ladies then discussed the weather in Geneva, Moscow, and Washington, and the jet lag, which apparently affected them more than it did their husbands. A remark about the bouquets in the room led to a discussion of flowers. Mrs. Gorbachev's favorite flowers are the roses, she said, and after those, she would prefer wildflowers. And then Mrs. Reagan spoke of the beauties of wildflowers at their ranch in California. Both ladies expressed their hope that this meeting in Geneva would lead to greater understanding between their two countries, and eventually to peace in the world for this future and future generations.
We want now to give you several other perspectives on the meeting. The first is a report of the meeting from United Press International. Quote, the petite auburn-haired Soviet First Lady arrived in a tan cloth raincoat, simple black suit with a high-necked white silk shirt and black high heels. Mrs. Reagan greeted her outside the mansion's French doors. The two First Ladies posed briefly for photos, then hurried out of the wintry day to a small salon for tea. Mrs. Gorbachev, 52, answering a reporter's shouted question, do you speak English? Responded, yes, I do. Do you? She sat awkwardly on the edge of her gilt-trimmed chair, looking uncomfortable for the first time in the day. The tea lasted about an hour afterward. Mrs. Reagan said she thought the stylish Mrs. Gorbachev is a very nice lady.
If I was nervous about meeting Raisa Gorbachev, and I was, she was probably even more nervous about meeting me. I didn't know what I would talk about with her, but I soon discovered that I needed to have worried. From the moment we met, she talked and talked and talked. She never stopped talking, or lecturing to be more accurate, about the Soviet Union, communist system, Soviet art, Marxism, and Leninism. I wasn't prepared for this, and I didn't like it. I had assumed we would talk about personal matters, husbands, our children, being in the limelight, or perhaps our hopes for the future. When she came to the tea in Geneva, she struck me as a woman who expected to be deferred to. And then Nancy shares this story about Raisa. When she walked into the room, she didn't like the chair that she was seated in, so she started to snap her fingers at the KGB, who promptly would get up and move her to another chair. And then she'd sit in that chair for a few minutes, and she decided she didn't want to like that chair either, so she snapped her fingers again, and they moved her again. But Nancy would comment later that that this behavior seemed to not repeat itself, and she chalked it up to being that Raisa was just very nervous. But Nancy did mention that, she was called Bo Derek of the Steppes, as the press would call her, and that day she noted, Nancy would say that she was dressed like a prison matron. It was a long black skirt, a white shirt, and a black tie. But Nancy soon understood why that was. That day they were taking the only single photograph of Raisa that they were going to send back from the Geneva summit to her home country. And Nancy would say, I knew she was under pressures that I couldn't even imagine. I didn't envy her. When the Gorbachevs landed in Genevieve, I noticed they got off the plane together, but when they returned to Moscow, he got off in front of her without her, and she left discreetly through the rear exit of the plane. It would have driven me crazy to have acted one way at home and completely different abroad.
On October 11th and 12th, 1986, in Reykjavik, Iceland, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met for their second summit. This summit was something of a surprise since Gorbachev had proposed the meeting with Reagan less than 30 days before it was held. Nancy Reagan was under the impression that wives would not accompany their husbands to the summit. The American delegation felt they were told too late that Raisa Gorbachev would indeed be coming to the summit with her husband. Without Nancy Reagan to take up any of the spotlight, Raisa was front and center in Reykjavik. Further magnifying Raisa's presence was an information blackout that had been imposed by both the Americans and Soviets about the talks between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. The press had nothing else to do except follow Raisa around as she wowed Icelanders. In a single day, Raisa changed clothes 4 times while touring the city, visiting museums, and even a mineral spring bath. Traveling around Reykjavik in a black limousine, she made no less than 8 stops. While meeting with school children, she handed out linen pens. Meanwhile, her grim-faced KGB guards took to handing out candy for the children. Raisa also had something very serious to say about the talks between her husband and President Reagan. They must come up with peace. I don't doubt that our efforts, all efforts, win the nuclear threat. We must not give up.
This is from a New York Times article entitled The Iceland Summit, a public relations coup for Moscow in October of 1986. This is just started to give you an understanding of how they were describing the races while she was there. When Raisa Gorbachev was asked if she was sorry Nancy Reagan had not come, she responded, "There must be a cause for her not coming. Maybe she had something else to do, or maybe she is sick. There are many who are interested in the wife gap than they are in the missile gap." Some of the Americans felt that the Russians had put one over on them by not giving more notice that Mrs. Gorbachev would be going to Iceland. So Mrs. Reagan's schedule could be arranged to permit her to go too. When President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev closeted house to house, and Nancy Reagan with home in Washington, Raisa Gorbachev had the international stage all to herself. She packed the day of visits and conversations. She said she wanted to come with her husband because they cannot lose the chance to visit Iceland. The Soviet First Lady, who was once criticized on a visit to Paris for wearing the same outfit twice, did not need to be told twice. She changed her clothes 4 times, wearing a succession of silk blouses, tailored skirts, and suede boots. She also changed earrings with each new outfit. She wore light frosted pink lipstick and nail polish. Everyone who met the Soviet leader's wife thought she was beautiful and charming, gentle and knowledgeable. This demonstrates, as the husbands are behind closed doors dealing with this, the media has nothing to focus on except what these women are doing. Raisa had a really important reason for being there. Nancy's office as First Lady is an established office. It's an established position with some degree of respect. For Raisa, there is no respect for her position. There isn't even a word in the language for First Lady. So she's trying to create this office to build it up, to have more of a position and to actually have a place there. But I do find it interesting that, as I noted before, that the media has to focus so uberly on what she's wearing and how many times she changes clothes. It will be noted, though, what Nancy had to say. The divide between Nancy and Reagan grew as a result of her attendance, and Nancy said, "I was furious that the Russians were not negotiating in good faith. I was also angry that Raisa had been there. Her presence seemed frivolous as mine would have been. It put me in a really awkward position, and I felt Raisa was testing me. They saw more of Raisa than Ronnie or Gorbachev at that summit."
It's extremely important to note, Jenny, that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev's talks in Reykjavik nearly resulted in a landmark agreement to abolish all nuclear weapons in a decade. It faltered due to Reagan's unwillingness to compromise on his Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars system, which in theory might be able to shoot down all incoming missiles. And it also faltered on Gorbachev's equal unwillingness to ignore American research and development on the system. The Strategic Defense Initiative was never implemented. Also, nuclear weapons are still very much with us today. The Gorbachevs came to Washington for a summit lasting from December 7th through the 10th in 1987. The most famous or infamous part of the summit for Nancy Reagan, Raisa Gorbachev, was a White House tour that Nancy took Raisa on in full view of the media. The 45-minute tour turns into a battle of wheels and control as Raisa made critical remarks and Nancy attempted to stay composed. The tour offered a stark contrast between American and Soviet cultural norms. While Americans valued politeness, Soviet citizens were much more apt to speak their minds and give an honest assessment of what they actually thought about the situation. It mattered much less to them if the host's feelings got hurt in the process. Nancy was always someone who conducted herself with the utmost decorum. Raisa spoke her mind, which was viewed as being brutally honest, especially in this case. The first stop on the First Lady's White House tour was at a portrait of Pat Nixon. This was where the battle was joined, so to speak. While Nancy was talking about the portrait, Raisa's attention was taken over by a portrait of Lady Bird Johnson. She then asked in a didactic tone, "This picture that we face, to what century does it belong?" I would say it's a typical picture of the 20th century. Raisa had a reply or rebuttal every time Nancy said something. For instance, when they entered the state dining room, Nancy said, "This is where we were last night," alluding to the state dinner that occurred less than 24 hours earlier. Raisa replied, "It seems to be much smaller today." When Nancy took Raisa into the Red Room, Raisa reminded her that she had already visited the room a day earlier and been given a tour by Helena Schultz, the Secretary of State's wife. Raisa quizzed Nancy with such fervor that many of the replies had to be given by the White House's chief curator, Betty Mockman.
So it should be noted that it took weeks and weeks to prepare for this visit and to prepare for the tour, and there were a lot of details that had to go into that. In addition, when Nancy and Ronald Reagan extended the invitation for Raisa to come to the White House for this tour, it was met with no answer. But it was noted that Raisa responded already to other White House invitations, and then finally responded there in DC, but then finally responded to Nancy and Ronald's invitation. And then the last sort of, issue was that she also changed the time of the meeting that day to meet her obligations to meet other people in DC, and then asked that the tour and coffee take only an hour. And Nancy would say, "Because we only had an hour, I was eager to get things moving, but that was difficult because Raisa kept stopping to talk to the press. When I put my hand on her arm, she'd pull away. I finally had to say, if we don't get moving along, we'll never have time for coffee." The tour did go longer than expected due to Raisa's incessant questioning. This caused both President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev to have to wait an extra 10 minutes to the time to finish. And there's this really funny story that when they finally came into the women came into the room, the men were looking at their watch and making fun of the ladies. So at the end of the tour, Raisa gave her assessment of the White House as an official house. I would say that humanly speaking, a human being would like to live in a regular house. This is a museum. Raisa was nothing if not honest. But you have to recall that 2 decades after Jackie Kennedy's renovations, the Reagans are moving into the White House and discovered it was in a little bit of a disrepair. The plumbing and wiring were old-fashioned, the floors needed work, the draperies were falling apart. So Nancy's Reagan, careful attention to detail and trying to watch finances, underwent the 1981 renovation of the White House to restore it to its glory. While the public would criticize the cost of this, she actually secured a fair number of those donations from private donors instead of using government funds. She says, "This house belongs to all Americans," she told Architectural Digest this, "and I want it to be something of which they are proud." Nancy's pride for this restoration work was sort of a kick in the gut when Raisa made that comment. And Nancy wanted to show more of the White House to her, but because of the way the tour went and the lack of time, she didn't get to. So Nancy would later say, "It was easy to make a mistake when practically every word you utter is taken down by the press, especially when you're operating in an entirely different culture with its own rules and customs, not to mention the language problem." In Washington, Raisa had said that the White House was more of a museum than a home. I'm sure she didn't intend that to be rude. The comment just slipped out.
So now the tables are turned, so to speak, because the Reagans are going to go to the Soviet Union, make their first trip there. And they visited Moscow at the Gorbachev's invitation for a summit in late May over 4 days that lasted June 1st in 1988. Once again, sparks are going to fly when Raisa and Nancy meet. Longtime White House journalist Helen Thomas, who was in Moscow to cover the summit, summed up the frosty relations between Nancy and Raisa best when she said, quote, "You could have stored meat in the room when the two were together." On the final day of the summit, Soviet authorities arranged for Nancy to tour the Tretyakov Gallery and view rare Russian religious icons dating back to the early Middle Ages. At the time, the gallery was undergoing renovation. Raisa was not at the appointed place to meet Nancy when she arrived and took it upon herself to begin the tour before her guest arrived. Raisa commented to the media that Nancy was late, something Nancy's staff would later dispute. When Nancy did arrive, she took charge despite Raisa's efforts to control the situation. As Raisa gets ready to begin the tour, Nancy's going to stop and she says, quote, "Now wait a minute, I want to say something, okay?" She then stated to Raisa and the gallery's director, "I want to thank you for allowing my request that the 5 icons I wanted to see be brought in for me to see. I'm very grateful to you both, everybody concerned, and I'm anxious to see them, but I'm also aware that a lot of people have not seen them. I'm very grateful." Raisa then told the assembled media there would be no interviews when they tried to ask questions. Nancy had other ideas.
So when the reporters told Nancy that Raisa had spoken with them about the icons before she arrived, but would never reference their religious heritage, Nancy took this opportunity to lay out her position. "I don't know how you can neglect the religious implications. I mean, they are there when you see them." On that same tour, when Nancy was asked by the press about her impressions of communism, she said, "We have 2 different ways of living. We have 2 different philosophies. That's not going to change." In truth, there were many differences between Raisa and Nancy on politics, culture, their respective backgrounds. It's a little wonder the relationship was strained at times. Both were 2 powerful and very glamorous women who were used to having a spotlight, and sharing it was not in either of their natures.
So the last time Nancy and Raisa meet while their husbands are both still in office occurred on December 7th, 1988 in New York City. And this is when the President Reagan, Vice President, soon to be President George H.W. Bush, and Mikhail Gorbachev met for a one-day summit. Also, Gorbachev addressed the United Nations on that visit. Meanwhile, Nancy and Raisa attended a luncheon given at the home of the wife of the UN Secretary General, Marcela Perez Cuellar. By this point in the relationship, I think it's important to understand that the fierce brinksmanship that Nancy and Raisa had exhibited in those first 3 summits seemed to become a thing of the past. Each woman would extend an invitation for the other to come visit them again in their home country later on. Raisa seemed almost wistful when she said, quote, "I would like to think this is not our last meeting. Human beings live with dreams for the future." She seemed genuinely nostalgic when she said, "I will miss you and your husband. As for the 2 of us, it was destiny that put us at the place we were, next to our husbands, to help bring about the relationship that our countries now have." For her part, Nancy later complimented Raisa's energetic persona, telling soon-to-be First Lady Barbara Bush how, quote, "She, Raisa, never looks tired." By all accounts, the luncheon was an enjoyable afternoon, as Nancy would later state. That positive expression shows just how far the relationship had come in a few years.
Nancy remembers this meeting by saying, "Fortunately, there is a happy postscript to my difficult relationship with Raisa. Something had changed. At that table, Raisa talked with Matilda Cuomo and acknowledged that Soviet society had not done a good job in the area of childcare. Raisa would say, 'We could have done this better. We had always provided daycare in the mother's workplace, but now I think it might have made more sense to keep the children at home for the first few years.'" Raisa talked, but this time she didn't lecture. The atmosphere was warmer than usual, and I was touched by what she told me about our destinies. If Raisa and I had been left alone without any press, we probably would have had an easier time of it. But even before our first meeting in Geneva, there had been so much talk about the 2 of us that we were both enormously self-conscious. In any event, I'm very glad that we saw each other one last time in New York, which was a nice ending to a relationship that had obviously been difficult for us both.
So, over the past 3 years, Nancy and Raisa had suffered the one tense confrontation after another, as we've outlined today. Their relationship was defined by a battle of strong-willed personalities. On the other hand, their last official meeting was cordial, polite, and respectful. At this point in their public lives, Nancy Reagan was within weeks of becoming a former First Lady. As for Raisa, she and her husband were on the verge of being buffeted by historic events, including the fall of the Iron Curtain and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, which would occur late 1991. Neither woman could foresee what the future held for them or their spouses. That was probably a good thing. In September 1990, the Reagans visited the Gorbachevs in Moscow. Less than 2 years later, the Gorbachevs reciprocated when they took up the Reagans' invitation to visit them at their ranch in California. This invitation had been extended while both men were still in office. By this time, Ronald Reagan was already suffering from Alzheimer's disease, which would cripple him over the last years of his life. Meanwhile, Mikhail Gorbachev had been ousted from power in the Soviet Union, and not long thereafter, it disintegrated. These were strange, some might even say absurd endings to the political careers of two men who came closer than any others to abolishing nuclear weapons. From the very start, the relationship between the two men was always warm, the polar opposite of the sometimes contentious relationship between their two wives. In retirement, both Nancy and Raisa seemed to let go of the past, at least when the two met in 1992.
Both women wrote memoirs. In Nancy Reagan's My Turn, she would expound on their tense relationship she had with Raisa in a chapter entitled The Russians. Raisa's memoir, I hope, is more of like an long interview style with the respected Russian journalist who acted as her interlocutor. Raisa was the only briefly mentions her relationship with Nancy in the summit meetings. And from what little Raisa says about Nancy, and I hope, it seems that she had a few issues with her, and it was more creation of the media than anything substantive. Either that, or Raisa may have decided just to keep it all her feelings private about it. But interestingly, in the memoir, Raisa mentions Nancy's successor, Barbara Bush, several times. Raisa accompanied Barbara to Wellesley College, where the First Lady had a wonderful experience, where Barbara Bush was giving a commencement speech in 1991, and Raisa had a wonderful experience with the women there. They got along very well, and their interactions were troubled. There were many trials and tribulations in the years to come for both couples. Nancy would watch her beloved Ronnie as his mental faculties continued to deteriorate. She never left Ronald's side as they retreated completely from public life. Conversely, it would be Mikhail who would then stand vigil at Raisa's bedside as she would succumb to leukemia in 1999. Upon Raisa's death, her old sparring partner, Nancy Reagan, said that she was shocked and deeply saddened by Raisa's death. We believe that Raisa was a strong partner with her husband and an important voice in the friendship that our two countries established in the 1980s. The friendship between Raisa and Nancy was always a work in progress, but it managed to stand the ultimate pressure cooker. Multiple superpower summits were nothing less than with nothing less than world peace at stake.
So one of the best analysis of the effect Raisa Gorbachev had in elevating her position from the wife of the Soviet leader to First Lady status came in an editorial in the Irish Times that was published just 5 days after she died in September 1999. Quote, "No woman made a greater impact on Soviet politics than Raisa Gorbachev. She was not elected to any office of state, nor was she ever likely to be. But her influence over her husband was immense. In the West, she was a show stealer, a Russian First Lady, who not only did not look like a babushka, but who changed her outfits 4 times a day. And those outfits came not from Moscow's promising designers, but straight from the Paris fashion houses of Pierre Cardin and particularly Yves Saint Laurent, for whom she organized a fashion show in Moscow in 1986. There were stories of massive spending sprees on haute couture. It became known that she possessed a piece of notoriously anti-communist equipment, a credit card. As admiration for Russia's First Lady was promoted in the West by the major fashion magazines, her standing at home diminished dramatically. Raisa Gorbachev's wardrobe, so admired in the West, came to be regarded by the average Russian woman as a symbol of Communist Party privilege. Her influence in getting 40% of the country's health budget devoted to mother and child care, and the fact that she virtually wrote the extremely progressive sections on women in her husband's keynote speech to the 27th Congress of the Communist Party in 1987, the crucial year of glasnost and perestroika, all this was quickly forgotten.
So not unlike Jackie Kennedy, Nancy Reagan wanted to bring glamour and glitz to Washington. Opponents of Ronald Reagan seized on her decisions to wear expensive clothing, renovate the White House in this challenging economic times. In Nancy's mind, the presidency had been devalued and debased after a decade of poor leaders. She helped to create a White House and an image of the presidency, for better or worse, that made the institution larger than life. Nancy Reagan was also a policy advocate. Her most well-known cause was the war on drugs. Just say no. She spent a good deal of her time after 1982 working as part of the national campaign to convince those kids to just say no to drugs. She would travel to 27 states and 44 cities to talk about the issue, and then would convene 2 times an international First Ladies Conference to address the problem. She also loomed larger in life in the daily life of the White House politics. First ladies can be vital partners in diplomatic relations, and Nancy Reagan certainly was. Her rapport with Mikhail and Raisa was essential to nurturing the warm and productive relationship that the president developed with the Soviet Union. The president would praise her for helping to calm relations between the 2 superpowers, pushing him to abandon his blistering rhetoric during his first term, where he blasted the Soviets. During the negotiations, she aggressively pushed back against more conservative politicians and advisors who were warning the president that this was a huge mistake. Nancy Reagan was at times a controversial first lady, but her life offers a powerful evidence of a role of a spouse that can play in shaping the legacy of the White House.
So we got to ask ourselves, why did the media fixate on Nancy and Raisa at the superpower summits that occurred between the U.S.-Soviet Union during the last half of the 1980s? I think the answer is pretty simple. Nuclear arms control, while of the utmost importance to both the United States, Soviet Union, and the world, is really not that interesting to the average citizen. Talk about reducing the number of nuclear weapons was the business side of superpower summitry. The personal side was much more fascinating and relevant to not only the media, but also the general public.
So the dynamics of these 2 extremely powerful women interacting was newsworthy then, as it would still be today. Nancy and Raisa were more representative of the prevailing cultures in their country. What they said and did and wore was an expression of not only the United States, but the Soviet Union. It also fueled a competition that cannot be separated from the larger Cold War. Neither women would wield political, economic, or military power. In that regard, Nancy and Raisa were like citizens in their own countries. They relied on their personal strengths to combat each other during those meetings. For Raisa, that strength manifested itself in honesty and intellect. For Nancy, it was displayed through her tact and her elegance. These were traits that everyone followed the summits could identify with. Their meetings might be best summed up as politics by the other means. Those means were each other's unique personalities. The relationship between Nancy and Raisa, for better or worse, defined not only the 2 of them, but also reflected the values and the cultural norms of the 2 competing superpowers of the time.
In 1999, Raisa was stricken with leukemia. Thousands of cards and gifts were sent to her in Münster, Germany, where she was getting treatment. The outpouring of sympathy, specifically from Russian citizens, was heartfelt and long overdue. One of the most poignant testimonials to Raisa's legacy appeared in the Russian newspaper Izvestia. Fragile and elegant, with a refined taste for beautiful clothes, she became a symbol of a country liberating itself from drabness. But we didn't understand her, perhaps because we didn't want to understand her. Perhaps we demanded too much of this family when they were in power, but we didn't break them. And meanwhile, we ourselves have changed. We've become human beings. It turned out we had forgotten how to share a stranger's grief. But now, for the saddest of reasons, we are showing respect for 2 people who love each other, Raisa and Mikhail. Mikhail Gorbachev read the article to his wife in her hospital room. After he finished reading, Raisa quietly whispered, It turns out you have to die to be understood.
That story is so poignant and actually heartbreaking. I think there are a lot of first ladies who could respect that. Nancy Reagan said, "You learn something out of everything, and you come to realize more than ever that we're all here for a certain space of time, and then it's going to be over, and you better make this count." James Baker, who served as the White House Chief of Staff during Reagan's first term, told PBS in 2011, "If there's one woman who was indispensable to Ronald Reagan's political success, it was Nancy Reagan." Nancy was an ardent supporter of her husband's policies, but when she felt that she could be a messenger of hope, she stepped up. It took enormous courage for Reagan to ignore critics, and Mrs. Reagan was responsible more than anyone else for urging him forward. She not only worked behind the scenes with Reagan's inner circle of advisors to urge the change of direction on the Soviet Union, but played a major diplomatic role in bringing the Soviet Union to the negotiating table. Mrs. Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev would continue to actually correspond the years afterwards, and they would write each other letters and wishing them well on holidays and birthdays and keep continuing to catch up. Gorbachev would say, "I just recently received yet another letter from Nancy. Raisa is gone, now both the Reagans are gone, and I feel sorry, very sorry. Of course, age takes its toll, there's nothing you can do about it. But God gave her plenty of time that she lived through to good purpose, both for her family and for her country, and for improving our relations, human ones, both between the two presidents and between our two countries," Gorbachev said. That is the end of our presentation. I'm going to turn off the slideshow so that Allison can go to any questions there might be.
Sure. There is a question in the chat about what types of reporters were assigned to these first ladies. The discussion of being fashion editors, or because fashion was such a subject, if the types of reporters impacted the coverage, or sort of what the media reception was, who was writing about them and how they were writing.
I will answer for the Soviet thing. I'll let Jenny answer for the American side of that question. The Soviet Union information was very tightly controlled. The reporters who would be covering Raisa would have been part of TASS, that was the official Soviet news agency. Also, there was the official party paper, I quoted it there earlier, is Vestia. Any kind of coverage of her would have been vetted, censored, and strictly controlled. And just to give you an idea of how controlled the environment Raisa was in, especially when she was back home, from what I understand, Jenny, we came across a story where the plane lands in Moscow, he gets off the front, she gets off the back. And I think Nancy Reagan is the one who brought up that story. So everything is very tightly controlled. There would not have been very many people in the press covering her.
So on the American side, it's not unlike today, right? It's everything from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Politico, and all those types of papers and so forth. And then, of course, there would have been other types of media. So it could have been like a fashion editorial side of it too. So it was a mixture of everything. When you look at photographs or even video recordings from some of those summits and meetings, you certainly see, Raisa even mentions it. She talks about, oh my gosh, there are so many reporters. You know, the cameras are on, the flashes are going, microphones are in their face, which is so different for Raisa. She's not used to that, but at the same time, she looks at it, you know, and I actually admire her a little bit for this. She looked at it as an opportunity. Nancy, you know, is used to it, but for her, we look at it here maybe from an American perspective, it's an annoyance, right? It's an invasion. For Raisa, it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to have a voice and to share her opinions, and you know, and to have a moment for herself and to be herself.
Excellent points, Jenny. Excellent. Other questions?
Chris, can you talk about how Raisa reflected women in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I did some looking into this, and just a disclaimer, part of my academic background is in American foreign policy and international studies, and I've spent quite a bit of time in Eastern Europe. And the role of women is very different over there, and it has changed some since the wall and the Iron Curtain fell, but still it's very traditional. But the role of women in the Soviet Union actually, I believe, infused the criticism of Raisa Gorbachev. On one hand, the communist system that was implemented following the Russian Revolution in 1917 liberated women to a certain extent from the home. Lots of them went to work in factories. Of course, many of them were still working out in the fields as well. Women's literacy exploded. It went up to a very high quality. It's still that way today. It's one of the good legacies of that system. And educational opportunities soared. And I think Rez is reflective of that. But politics, it was a complete men's world. There were 138 members ever named of the Soviet parliament. That's their de facto parliament, the Politburo. Only 4 were ever women. So Reza is really a rebel. She is really path-breaking, but I think she got huge amounts of criticism. I think any woman before her who affected the Soviet leaders, there was no one like her, but anyone who did would have said something to them behind closed doors. Everything would have been hush-hush. She was not that way. She was out front.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's another question here about how did each woman influence the position of First Lady?
So that's an interesting conversation. So we get to tell the stories of how each First Lady makes their sort of impact in the White House. This is an opportunity for Hollywood to come to the White House. And economically, at that point, our country was challenged. There was a lot going on the world landscape. Reagan was Ronald Reagan was a president who spoke his mind and very passionately about the topics that he believed in so passionately, and so he would bring that legacy then into from the governorship into the presidency. And Nancy really knew how to sort of settle Ron down, and I think that played on the world stage side of it, obviously with the Soviet negotiations. But in many other ways, she would influence him or try at least to tone him down. And I think for Nancy, she really felt, she talks a lot about this in My Turn and several interviews she gave. She felt that not first ladies, but presidents who had been immediately before Ronald had, led to this sort of lackluster love of the White House at that time. And so she really wanted to elevate not only his position, but the White House. And she wanted it to feel, again, like the people's house, that it was a place for everybody to be welcome at, and that we had pride in that house. And so that's why she felt it was important to do the work that she did there. But I think, not unlike many other first ladies, Nancy certainly received the criticism and ire of many, media outlets, and that certainly affected Nancy. She was very aware of it. She talked about it, and she would respond to those at certain times. And so I think that she was very brave and had some courage in doing so at a time where she wasn't always a favorite.
I would say, as far as Raisa, as Jenny alluded to earlier, there was no, and I don't think there is today, any word in the Russian language for First Lady. There was no, quote, position, official or unofficial, for First Lady. That continues today in Russia. You do not see the wife of the leader of Russia, hardly at all. Did you ever see Vladimir Putin is actually now divorced from his wife Ludmila, but you would very rarely see her. But Raisa created something totally new. And I think one thing that we need to keep in mind, Mikhail Gorbachev was the face of a new Soviet Union that was very open, that was trying to be very transparent. And I think that Raisa played right along with that. And I think she sort of created a position that did not exist. Unfortunately, that position pretty much vanished with the end of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I would say we'll wrap up with one last question. We lost Allison, but
Okay.
we'll wrap up and close out for everyone. I would say, you know, the thing that was the most powerful thing for me in this conversation, we talked a lot about cultural differences, language issues. I mean, imagine trying to have these conversations with somebody you don't know, and you know the media, as it's been said over and over again by both these women and ourselves, that the media is interpreting every little thing they do and what they're saying. And then you have a language barrier. So they're using interpreters. That causes its own challenges. And then last but not least, you know, they start, you know, the media starts to articulate this strained relationship, which probably does influence. I'm sure, and I think Nancy says it best when she says she just chalks things up to nerves and the constant eye of everything on what they're doing. You know, Nancy's way is she just becomes very just official and poised in those situations. Raisa takes it as an opportunity perhaps maybe to sort of just push forward, but either way they're both used as sort of combative to each other. So I do think it's interesting the media does end up playing such, and Nancy said those words so correctly, that maybe if the media would have left them alone, maybe they would have been better off to have had better conversations, to have been able to understand one another better, and so forth and so on. But I will say it is interesting when you read through those accounts to see sometimes the most ridiculous things that are counted on, and you know, there was a raise of an eyebrow, or her, you know, she wore this lipstick, and why would she do that, and why did she wear this color versus that color, versus focusing on the politics of what was happening and how important this was.
I think, to me, all those things you said, you really hit the nail on the head. And I think, to me, from the Raisa end of things, I was so impressed from what she came from to what she rose up to be, to overcome those circumstances. And I think those circumstances really, just like they did for Nancy, the whole Hollywood, growing up in relative affluence, made Raisa who she was. And she literally came from what we would consider in this country to be abject poverty. Now, the Soviet citizens would not have at that time, seeing as that, because so many of them were in that position. Her husband, the same way. I found a quote from him where he said, "We were basically beggars, but I thought life was great." He grew up in a very agricultural region in southern Russia. But the way she was able to transcend her, not just what she grew up as and the poverty she grew up in, but also the way she was able to transcend what wives of Soviet general secretaries and leaders had done before, is absolutely incredible. And I think also we should express some sympathy for her in that she, those first meetings, she really was really on edge. She had no training for this, none at all. And it's just really not surprising. But really, when I look back on this, and I was growing up then, the Gorbachevs, especially in retrospect, are incredible people. It doesn't matter if the Soviet Union vanished or not, and Mikhail Gorbachev's still with us. These are incredible people, and the world became a safer place because of them, and it became a safer place because of Raisa Gorbachev's work and also Nancy Reagan's. And those are the untold stories of first ladies, whether in the United States or overseas, that we don't hear a lot about, but their influence is tremendous, or was tremendous.
I think, you know, Raisa's final words of "it turns out you have to die to be understood" it's just, that's it. I mean, I think that,
Yep.
again, it's important. That's so poignant for her life story. And I think, again, as we know from many other first ladies here in the United States. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
You know, Allison noted there are some programs that are coming up. Please follow us on social media. So we have, you know, we have programs like this all the time, but then on social media, we do lots of programs, videos, and so forth. National Park Service has Instagram Live today. Actually, it should be coming up here shortly. I can't even see my clock to see what time it is, but I think it's coming up here in about an hour. So look on the NPS site for First Ladies National Historic site, and always, of course, on National First Ladies Library. Thank you all so much, and we hope you enjoyed the program, and we'll see you next time.
Gospodanya.